explain your role in the Kansas City, Missouri School District during the years between 1971 and 1997?
I had a couple of different roles with the school district during that time period. I became involved in 1991. The judge who was over the school desegregation case, Judge Russell Clark, appointed a citizens committee of 13 members called the Desegregation Monitoring Committee, which everyone called the DMC. And they were charged with ensuring his court orders were implemented. That was chaired by Dr. Eugene Eubanks, and I served as the executive director for that committee from about 1991 to about 1994. And then later in the 90s, I was the in-house legal counsel for the school district, and I worked on the school desegregation case in that capacity, probably up until the case was dismissed in about 2003. Well, Kansas City was a unique situation. The Jenkins case had a remedy imposed on it that was really unlike any other that had been done before it. When the case was filed in 1977, it wasn't actually concluded until 1987 when Judge Clark decided how the integration efforts would take place. And during that time period, the demographics in the district were very predominantly minority, and there weren't actually enough non-minority students in the district to effectuate the integration. And as part of the litigation, all of the suburban school districts were found not to be liable, so they weren't involved in the case. So this idea of having a magnet program that would attract non-minorities back into the district came up. There was also the judge imposed a tax levy, which hadn't been done before. He also imposed salary increases for teachers, which was another unique thing that had never been done before. So we had a lot of unique efforts. Probably the most newsworthy, I think, was the capital improvements program, because in order to attract the non-minority students, the court and the plaintiffs in the case wanted something that we called back in those days suburban comparable schools. So there was a massive capital improvements program to the tune of ended up to being several $1 billion, along with the educational remedies. I would say it was mixed. I think there was a lot of excitement and welcoming about the funding, because the schools had been horribly underfunded. The buildings were crumbling, they were in horrible conditions. But I also believe there was a feeling that there was a loss of local control. There was, a lot of court supervision involved with it. The monitoring committee was involved. There was an extraordinary amount of media coverage back then. The Kansas City Star actually had 2 reporters assigned to the school district. In every meeting there was, news media, and that was very unusual back in those days. Some of the aspects of the remedy had to be refined. There were ratios, ethnic ratios, and some of the unintended consequences of those early on were that minority students actually couldn't get into some of the more popular programs, and that was later rectified. And also, some schools were left as neighborhood traditional schools, but they weren't given the same amount of funding as the magnet schools, and so there was a point where it appeared that a 2-tiered system was being created, but that again was corrected later on. But I think those things might have put off some of the community at certain times. And additionally, I think when recruitment for administrators and teachers was required to be done nationally, I think that some of the people who had served the district for a long period of time were resentful of some of those efforts. I think probably similar to any place else in the country. With progress comes change, and change is difficult, and you often give up things with change. Certainly, there are still people today who marvel at the things that were accomplished in segregated communities when everyone knew who their teacher was and you went to church with your teacher, and those things certainly have been lost. Obviously, society has evolved since then, so there is some sense of loss, I believe, but I think the hope that things would be better prevailed over those kind of sentiments. The students, I think, really didn't weigh in that much unless it affected them directly, and I think, unfortunately, in opening and closing schools and moving students around, that obviously impacted students a great deal. Sometimes siblings were separated, going to different schools and things like that. But there was certainly a period when the magnet schools were flourishing where I think the students enjoyed the programs immensely, that they became attached to the schools, that they were exposed to a lot of things and friends that they wouldn't have otherwise encountered. Well, I would say I brought to the attention of the monitoring committee the disparities with the traditional schools, and my office conducted a study and filed a report with the court that resulted in, or helped to result in, the funding being changed. And I also think that I was influential in bringing to the attention the difficulties with the ethnic ratios that were preventing some minority students from attending some of the magnet schools. Because when I worked for the Desegregation Monitoring Committee, my office was actually in school district headquarters. I interacted with the school district administration on a daily basis and developed relationships with them and was able to respond, I think, to a lot of their needs to help with the things that they felt they needed to improve student achievement. Well, I guess, wasn't so much of an effect on me because my role was pretty well centered around the integration efforts, but when I was acting as the legal counsel for the school district, it was very time consuming, and for a period of maybe 2 years, I didn't work on anything but the desegregation case and no other legal matters. As I said, in the 90s, during that period when the magnet schools, most of them were in place and were very active. There was, trips abroad. There were students that went to the Galapagos Islands and to Spain and to Paris. They were exposed to all kinds of, new equipment, laboratories, art facilities, things that certainly the district could not have afforded the way things were going. So I think that would have had a huge impact. Well, I can speak for my own child who did attend the magnet schools, the Montessori school and the Foreign Language Academy. And she's grown now, but she developed friendships there that she maintains today. She has a very diverse group of friends, and they've all been together. They went to school the same way I think suburban students went to school and had field trips and activities that are sustaining them even today. I think that the case continued to reflect some of the issues that Kansas City still faces, of east of truth issues, issues about allocating resources. One of the things that I think is not always readily apparent about the school district case is the way the state funded the court-ordered remedies. And what they did was they basically took the allocations that they had for all the schools in Missouri and paid the remedy for St. Louis and Kansas City out of there. And the result was that the other school districts in the state saw their budgets cut, and it built up a certain amount of resentment toward Kansas City. And I believe that that probably lingers more than the internal Kansas City issues with the desegregation case. As controversial as the case was at some times, there was never any really violent resistance to it or anything like that like you saw in some other cities. But I do think that lingering resentment across the state still impacts Kansas City. I think as a society we have to address some of the challenges that students face and come to school with. I think that we have to put more resources into the schools and into just our communities and the lives that the students live. It's very difficult to concentrate on your schoolwork if you're fearful for your life, or you're hungry, or you're living with maybe someone who's mentally ill and those types of things. So I think we really have to be realistic and address the social needs of the students in some way and devote resources to that as well. I wanted to say that the attempts to integrate the schools in Kansas City were courageous and innovative. The courage of Judge Clark to implement some of the orders that he did that were highly criticized both in the legal field and by regular citizens. The work of Dr. Eugene Eubanks and Dan Levine and Ralph Parrish and those folks who came up with the magnet plans, and even those of us who were opponents, Arthur Benson, everyone was really working to make the school system better and give Kansas City something unique. So as controversial as it was, and as many lessons as there probably are to learn from it, we have been in a very unique position